I'm Sarah, and for 26 years I believed my family loved me. I believed that when my parents spent $8,000 on my brother Jake's custom gaming setup while I slept on a mattress with springs poking through the fabric, it was just because they were tight on money. I believed their explanations, their promises that my turn would come, their assurances that they treated us equally. But what I discovered 3 months ago when my grandmother passed away wasn't just about favoritism or poor financial priorities. What I found hidden in her house revealed a systematic deception that had shaped my entire life, and the moment I confronted my family with the truth, everything I thought I knew about them crumbled. If you've ever felt like the forgotten child, the one whose needs always came second, stay with me because this story might help you understand that sometimes the problem isn't with us. Let me take you back to understand how deep this goes. Growing up, Jake was 18 months younger than me, but you'd never know it from how our parents treated us. When he turned 16, they surprised him with a fully loaded gaming PC setup complete with dual monitors, a professional streaming setup, RGB lighting, a custom desk, and a gaming chair that cost more than some people's cars. $8,000, they proudly announced, because Jake had gotten decent grades and they wanted to support his interest in game design. Meanwhile, my mattress had been the same one since I was 12, and by then the springs were so bad that I'd wake up with indentations in my back. When I mentioned maybe getting a new mattress, my mom would sigh and say they'd just spent so much on Jake's setup. Could I wait a little longer? That little longer turned into 4 years. But it wasn't just the mattress. When Jake wanted to join the expensive travel baseball league, they found the money. When I wanted to take advanced art classes that cost $300, they said we needed to be more careful with spending. When Jake's car broke down, they immediately started shopping for a replacement. When my car started making concerning noises, they handed me a bottle of engine treatment and told me it should help. The pattern was so consistent that I started documenting it, not because I was planning anything, but because I began to doubt my own memory. Was I being dramatic? Was I imagining the differential treatment? The documentation revealed a startling truth. Over the course of my high school years, my parents spent approximately $15,000 on Jake's various interests, equipment, and activities. They spent roughly $2,000 on mine, and most of that was mandatory school fees they couldn't avoid. When I graduated high school with a 4.2 GPA and got accepted to 3 universities, my parents seemed pleased but made it clear that I'd need to figure out the financial aspects myself. When Jake graduated 2 years later with a 3.1 GPA and got accepted to a local community college, they immediately started talking about how they'd help with his expenses because he was still figuring things out. I took out student loans, worked 3 part-time jobs, and graduated with a degree in marketing and design. Jake lived at home, had his expenses covered, and eventually dropped out after 2 semesters to focus on his gaming content creation, which my parents supported because he was following his passion. The entire time, I kept thinking that once I proved myself, once I showed them I was responsible and successful, things would balance out. I thought their investment in Jake was just temporary, a phase they'd grow out of once they saw what I could accomplish. When I got my first job at a marketing agency making $42,000 a year, I was so proud. I called my parents immediately, expecting celebration, recognition, acknowledgement that their daughter had made it despite having no financial support. My mother's response was lukewarm congratulations, followed immediately by concern about whether I'd still have time to help Jake with his resume, since he was thinking about looking for part-time work. My father's reaction was to launch into a story about how Jake's latest gaming video had gotten 50 views, which was a new record for him. That pattern continued for years. When I got promoted and my salary increased to $58,000, they were pleased but spent most of the conversation discussing Jake's new business idea for a gaming cafe and wondering if I knew anything about business plans that might help him. When I bought my first car outright, with cash I'd saved, they admired it briefly before mentioning that Jake really needed transportation help and maybe I could give him advice about car shopping. When I moved into my own apartment, a spacious 1-bedroom that I'd furnished beautifully with pieces I'd saved for, they visited once, complimented it politely, and then suggested I might have room for Jake if he ever needed a place to stay while he got his life together. The breaking point should have been when I turned 25 and realized that in 7 years of full-time work, my parents had never once asked about my life, my goals, my dreams, or my struggles in any depth. Every conversation somehow centered back to Jake, his needs, his problems, his potential. But I was still caught in the cycle of trying to earn their recognition, still believing that if I just succeeded enough, loved them enough, proved myself enough, they'd see me the way I desperately wanted to be seen. Then my grandmother died. Grandma Rose had been the one person in my family who seemed to really see me. She'd always been quietly supportive, sending me cards on my achievements, asking detailed questions about my work, remembering the things that mattered to me. When she passed away last March, I was devastated not just because I loved her, but because I felt like I was losing the only family member who had ever truly valued me as an individual, rather than as Jake's older sister or my parents' helper. The family gathered for the funeral and the subsequent handling of her estate. Grandma Rose had been meticulous about her paperwork, and as we went through her belongings, I volunteered to help organize her financial documents since that kind of detail work was part of my job. My parents seemed relieved to let me handle the tedious paperwork while they focused on the more emotional aspects of sorting through her personal belongings. That's when I found the bank statements. Hidden in a folder marked Family Gifts were detailed records going back 12 years, documenting regular deposits my grandmother had made into an account I'd never heard of. The amounts were significant: $500 here, $1,000 there, $2,000 on special occasions. The deposits were labeled with notes like Sarah's college fund, Sarah's car fund, Sarah's future, and Sarah's wedding fund. According to these records, my grandmother had contributed over $32,000 over the years, specifically designated for me. But there was more. I found correspondence between my grandmother and my parents, letters where she expressed concern about the differential treatment she was observing. In one letter dated 3 years ago, she wrote that she was worried about the message being sent to me, that she hoped the money she was providing would help balance things out, and that she trusted my parents to use it appropriately when I needed support for major life events. My hands were shaking as I found the responses from my parents. They assured her that they were absolutely using the money for my benefit, that they were just being strategic about it, waiting for the right moments. They thanked her for her generosity and promised they were keeping track of everything carefully. The final piece of evidence was a separate folder containing receipts and records of exactly where that money had gone. Jake's gaming setup, Jake's car down payment, Jake's college expenses before he dropped out, Jake's various business ventures and equipment purchases. Every single dollar my grandmother had entrusted to my parents for my future had been redirected to my brother. I sat in my grandmother's quiet house, surrounded by the financial evidence of a 12-year deception, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just favoritism or poor financial planning. This was deliberate theft of money specifically intended for me, coupled with systematic lying to both me and my grandmother about where that money was going. They had stolen my grandmother's generosity and my opportunities, then gaslit me into believing I was being unreasonable when I noticed the disparity in how we were treated. I made copies of everything before anyone else saw the documents. Then I went home and spent 3 days processing what I'd learned. The money itself was devastating, but the betrayal was worse. Every time I'd struggled financially, every time I'd worked multiple jobs or stressed about expenses, every time they'd told me they simply couldn't help, there had been thousands of dollars sitting available that was specifically meant for me. They had watched me struggle while using my grandmother's money to fund Jake's comfortable lifestyle. But I also realized something else. In the 3 years since I'd started my career, I'd accomplished everything they'd claimed I couldn't do without their help. I'd bought a car, furnished an apartment, built an emergency fund, and established myself professionally. I'd done it all while they were actively sabotaging my support system and stealing money intended for my benefit. If anything, their deception had revealed my strength rather than my weakness. The confrontation happened the following Sunday at our regular family dinner. I'd been attending these dinners dutifully for years, watching Jake arrive empty-handed while I brought dessert or wine, listening to my parents celebrate his minor accomplishments while glossing over my major ones, participating in conversations that somehow always centered on his needs and problems. But this time, I came with the copied documents in a folder. I waited until we'd finished eating, until the conversation had inevitably turned to Jake's latest scheme for making money through streaming, until my mother had mentioned how tight things were financially, and how they were trying to figure out how to help him upgrade his equipment. Then I placed the folder on the table. I told them I'd found something interesting while organizing Grandma Rose's papers. I opened the folder and spread out the bank statements, the correspondence, and the receipts. I watched my parents' faces change as they realized what they were looking at. The color drained from my mother's face. My father started to speak, then stopped. Jake looked confused, clearly not understanding the significance of what he was seeing. I explained calmly and methodically what the documents revealed. I outlined the $32,000 my grandmother had provided specifically for me over 12 years. I read aloud from her letters expressing concern about how I was being treated and her hope that this money would help level the playing field. I showed them their own written promises to use the money appropriately for my benefit. Then I presented the receipts showing exactly where every dollar had actually gone. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my family. Jake was the first to speak, asking if this meant that his gaming setup had actually been bought with money meant for me. When I confirmed that yes, $8,000 of my grandmother's money had paid for his equipment, he looked genuinely shocked. I could see him mentally reviewing all the expensive things our parents had bought him over the years, beginning to understand that much of it had been purchased with money specifically designated for me. My mother's response was immediate deflection. She claimed they'd always intended to balance things out, that they were just managing the money strategically, that I was being dramatic about the whole situation. She insisted that they'd helped me too, that I was forgetting all the ways they'd supported me over the years. When I asked her to be specific about that support, she couldn't provide examples beyond basic parental obligations like food and shelter. My father tried a different approach, suggesting that my grandmother's money had helped the whole family, that Jake's success would eventually benefit everyone, that I was being selfish by focusing on technicalities instead of family unity. He pointed out that I'd turned out fine despite not getting direct financial support, which proved that their approach had worked. He seemed to think this was a compelling argument, that my success despite their sabotage somehow justified their behavior. But then something unexpected happened. Jake, who had been quiet during my parents' defensive responses, suddenly spoke up. He said he'd never known that the money for his things had come from Grandma Rose specifically for me. He said that changed everything, that he felt sick about it, that he wouldn't have accepted those things if he'd known. His response was the first genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing I'd heard from anyone in my family. My parents immediately shifted to damage control, telling Jake not to feel guilty, that this was all a misunderstanding, that they were the parents and it was their responsibility to make financial decisions for the family. They were clearly panicked that Jake might side with me or start questioning their treatment of us. But Jake kept shaking his head, saying it wasn't right, that $32,000 could have paid for my entire college education or helped me buy a house. That's when I realized the full scope of what had been taken from me. It wasn't just about mattresses or gaming equipment or car repairs. It was about the opportunities that money could have provided, the stress it could have eliminated, the different path my life might have taken if I'd had the financial support my grandmother had tried to give me. It was about years of being made to feel like I was asking for too much when I needed help, while money specifically designated for me was being spent on someone else's wants. I told my family that I needed time to process this betrayal and decide how to move forward. I explained that their response to being confronted with evidence of 12 years of deception and theft would determine whether we could have any kind of relationship going forward. I needed to see genuine accountability, not defensiveness and rationalization. I needed to see recognition of the harm they'd caused, not attempts to minimize or justify their actions. My mother's immediate response was to accuse me of trying to destroy the family over money, to suggest that I was being vindictive and unreasonable. She claimed that bringing this up was disrespectful to my grandmother's memory and that I was causing unnecessary drama. She seemed to genuinely believe that discovering their deception was somehow worse than the deception itself. My father tried to guilt me by pointing out everything they'd done for me over the years, conveniently ignoring that most of his examples were basic parental responsibilities, not special support. He suggested that I was being ungrateful, and that successful families don't keep score of financial contributions. He seemed completely unable to understand that this wasn't about keeping score, but about basic honesty and fairness. I left that dinner knowing that my relationship with my parents might never recover, but also feeling a clarity I'd never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I had concrete proof that my feelings about the differential treatment weren't in my head, weren't me being dramatic or oversensitive, weren't character flaws I needed to overcome. I had been systematically deceived and financially manipulated, and my grandmother's documentation proved it. The weeks that followed were difficult but also liberating. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma and financial abuse. She helped me understand that what my parents had done wasn't just poor judgment or favoritism, but a form of financial abuse that had profound psychological impacts. She explained that children who grow up with systematic differential treatment often develop complex trauma responses, including persistent feelings of unworthiness, overachievement as a coping mechanism, and difficulty trusting their own perceptions of reality. Working with her, I began to understand that my lifelong pattern of trying to earn my parents' recognition wasn't a character strength, but a trauma response. I'd been conditioned to believe that love and support had to be earned through achievement and perfection, rather than given freely as part of healthy family relationships. The therapy helped me recognize that no amount of success would ever be enough to change how my parents saw me, because the problem wasn't with my worthiness, but with their inability to see me as an individual rather than as Jake's sister or their helper. Meanwhile, Jake had been processing his own feelings about the situation. He reached out to me privately and asked if we could talk. When we met for coffee, he told me he'd been doing his own math about all the financial support he'd received over the years. He estimated that our parents had spent close to $40,000 on him between high school and now, while spending almost nothing on me. He said he'd never really thought about it before, but now that he was paying attention, he could see the disparity clearly. More importantly, he acknowledged that discovering the money had come from our grandmother specifically for me made him feel terrible about accepting it. He offered to start paying me back from his part-time job, even though it would take years. He also said he'd confronted our parents about their treatment of me and told them he thought what they'd done was wrong. Their response had been to minimize his concerns and suggest that he was being manipulated by me, which had actually opened his eyes further to their manipulative patterns. Having Jake's acknowledgement and support meant more to me than I'd expected. For the first time in my life, I had a family member who could see the dysfunction clearly and was willing to validate my experience rather than gaslight me about it. It didn't fix everything, but it helped me feel less isolated and crazy. My parents, meanwhile, had doubled down on their defensive position. They'd started telling extended family members that I was causing problems over money, that I was being unreasonable and vindictive, that they were disappointed in my character. They seemed to genuinely believe that being caught in their deception was somehow worse than the deception itself. They showed no genuine remorse, no acknowledgement of harm caused, no interest in making amends. Their response actually made my decision easier. My therapist had helped me understand that healthy relationships require basic elements like honesty, accountability, and mutual respect. When confronted with clear evidence of harmful behavior, healthy people feel genuine remorse and work to make amends. Unhealthy people deflect, minimize, blame the victim, and play victim themselves. My parents' response to being confronted with 12 years of documented deception fell clearly into the unhealthy category. 3 months after discovering the documents, I made the decision to go no contact with my parents while maintaining my relationship with Jake. I wrote them a letter explaining that I couldn't continue to have a relationship with people who had systematically deceived me, stolen money meant for me, gaslit me about their behavior, and then attacked my character when confronted with evidence of their actions. I told them that if they ever developed genuine remorse and wanted to make real amends, they could reach out, but that I wouldn't be participating in family events or maintaining regular contact until that happened. The response was exactly what I expected. My mother called me hysterical, accusing me of destroying the family and breaking my father's heart. She insisted that I was being dramatic and that all families have problems. She seemed genuinely unable to understand that some problems cross the line from normal family dysfunction into abuse. My father sent me a long email listing everything they'd ever done for me and demanding that I stop punishing them for trying their best. Neither response showed any recognition of wrongdoing or genuine desire to repair the relationship. But something interesting happened after I established those boundaries. Without the constant drain of trying to maintain relationships with people who fundamentally didn't respect or value me, I had energy for other things. I started focusing more on my career and discovered I had talents and ambitions I'd never fully explored. I got promoted again, this time to a senior marketing position with a salary of $72,000. I started taking art classes again, something I'd given up because my parents had made me feel like it was frivolous. I began developing friendships with people who appreciated me for who I was rather than what I could do for them. Most surprisingly, I started dating someone I'd met through work. David was kind, supportive, and genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings. The contrast between how he treated me and how my family had treated me was striking. He celebrated my successes without immediately redirecting the conversation to someone else. He showed interest in my problems without suggesting they were my fault or that I was being dramatic. He made me feel valued and appreciated just for being myself. When I told him about my family situation, his reaction was immediate validation. He said anyone who would steal money meant for their child and then gaslight them about it didn't deserve a relationship with that child. He helped me understand that the way my family had treated me wasn't normal or acceptable, that I deserved so much better. His support helped reinforce what I was learning in therapy about healthy relationships and appropriate boundaries. 6 months after going no contact, I got a call from Jake with unexpected news. Our parents had been bragging to relatives about his latest accomplishment. He'd gotten a part-time job at a local electronics store, and one of our aunts had made a comment about how proud Grandma Rose would have been to see both her grandchildren doing well. The comment had prompted our parents to mention how much Grandma Rose had supported the family financially over the years, apparently forgetting that they'd never told anyone about her contributions. Our aunt, who had been close to Grandma Rose, was confused by this comment. She knew our grandmother had been specifically concerned about how I was being treated and had been sending money specifically for me. When she pressed for details, our parents apparently gave conflicting and defensive answers that made her suspicious. She ended up calling Jake directly to ask what he knew about Grandma Rose's financial support. Jake, who had become much more aware of family dynamics since our confrontation, told our aunt the truth about what we'd discovered. He explained about the money, the deception, the systematic favoritism, and my decision to cut contact. Our aunt was horrified. She said she'd suspected there were problems but had never known the extent of it. She also revealed that Grandma Rose had confided in her about her concerns regarding my treatment and her hope that the money would help balance things out. More importantly, our aunt told Jake that she and several other relatives had been contributing to what they thought was a family college fund for both of us. They'd been sending money to our parents for years, specifically designated to help with our education and future plans. The total amount, according to her records, was over $15,000 from various relatives over the past decade. Jake asked our parents directly about this additional money. Their response was evasive and defensive, which confirmed his suspicions. He called our aunt back and told her what he'd learned. She was furious and started contacting other relatives who had contributed money. What they discovered was a pattern of financial deception that went far beyond what I'd uncovered in Grandma Rose's papers. Our parents had been accepting money from relatives specifically meant to support both of their children's futures, but had been using it primarily for Jake's expenses while telling everyone they were being fair and supportive to both of us. The total amount of money that had been redirected from its intended purpose was close to $50,000 over the years. I had been denied not just my grandmother's support, but the support of extended family members who had specifically wanted to help with my education and future. When Jake told me about this discovery, I felt a mixture of vindication and grief. Vindication because it proved that the pattern of deception was even more extensive than I'd realized. Grief because it meant that multiple family members had been trying to support me over the years, but their support had been intercepted and redirected without my knowledge. I could have graduated college debt-free. I could have had a down payment for a house. I could have had the financial security that would have allowed me to take risks and pursue opportunities instead of constantly worrying about basic expenses. The extended family's reaction was swift and decisive. Several relatives confronted my parents directly about the misuse of funds. Others stopped sending money entirely. A few reached out to me directly to apologize for not realizing what was happening and to offer belated support. The family dynamics shifted dramatically as people began to see the situation clearly and take sides based on principles rather than family loyalty. My parents' response to this wider exposure was to escalate their victim narrative. They claimed they were being persecuted for trying their best, that they were being unfairly judged by people who didn't understand their situation, that I was manipulating everyone against them. They seemed genuinely unable to understand that their behavior was the problem, not people's reaction to their behavior. But the damage to their reputation was significant. Family gatherings became awkward as people questioned their version of events. Their requests for financial help were met with skepticism. Their attempts to play victim were countered by relatives who had their own records of money sent specifically for me that had been misused. They found themselves isolated and defensive, facing consequences for their actions for the first time. Meanwhile, my life continued to improve. The promotion I'd received came with new responsibilities that I found deeply fulfilling. I was managing a team of 5 people and developing marketing strategies for major clients. My supervisor had started talking about the possibility of another promotion within the year, potentially moving me into a director-level position with a salary in the 6-figure range. For the first time in my life, I was experiencing professional recognition based on my actual abilities rather than having to constantly prove my worth. My relationship with David had also deepened. He'd met Jake and several of my supportive relatives, and they all agreed that he was a keeper. He'd been incredibly patient and supportive as I worked through the family trauma in therapy, never pressuring me but always being available when I needed to talk. He'd also helped me understand that my experience with my parents wasn't my fault and didn't define my worth as a person. 1 year after discovering my grandmother's documents, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to use part of my savings to establish a scholarship fund at my old high school, specifically for students whose families couldn't afford to support their educational goals. I wanted to create the kind of support system I'd needed but never had, to help other young people who were trying to succeed despite inadequate family support. The scholarship fund was a way to honor my grandmother's memory and her intention to support my future, even though her money had been stolen. It was also a way to transform my painful experience into something positive for others. I worked with the school counselors to identify students who showed academic promise but lacked family support, financial or otherwise. The first recipient was a young woman whose situation reminded me very much of my own. When I announced the scholarship fund on social media, the response was overwhelming. Friends, colleagues, and even distant relatives offered to contribute. Several people shared their own stories of family financial abuse and educational struggles. The fund grew beyond what I'd initially planned, and I realized I'd accidentally created a community of people who understood what it meant to succeed despite family dysfunction rather than because of family support. My parents' reaction to the scholarship fund was telling. Instead of recognizing it as a positive way to honor my grandmother's memory and help others, they saw it as another attack on them. They complained to relatives that I was making them look bad, that I was airing family business publicly, that I was being vindictive and attention-seeking. Their inability to see anything positive in my actions revealed how deeply their narcissistic patterns ran. Jake, on the other hand, was proud of what I'd accomplished and asked if there was any way he could contribute to the fund. He'd been working steadily at his job and had started community college classes in business administration. He'd also been slowly paying me back from his grandmother's money, insisting on it despite my telling him it wasn't necessary. His growth and accountability stood in stark contrast to our parents' continued defensiveness. The scholarship fund also attracted attention from my employer, who featured it in their corporate newsletter as an example of community engagement by their employees. This recognition led to conversations with senior leadership about my potential for advancement and my commitment to using my success to benefit others. It became another way that setting boundaries with my toxic family had opened up opportunities I never would have had while trying to manage those dysfunctional relationships. As I approach the 2-year anniversary of discovering my grandmother's documents, I can honestly say that going no contact with my parents was the best decision I've ever made. The constant stress of trying to earn love and recognition from people who are incapable of giving it has been replaced by relationships with people who value me for who I am. The energy I used to spend on managing their dysfunction has been redirected toward my career, my relationship, my friendships, and my scholarship fund. My therapist has helped me understand that healing from family trauma isn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It's about accepting reality and making choices based on what's healthy for you. Some family relationships can be repaired when people take accountability and do the work to change. Others can't be, and that's okay. Learning to distinguish between the two has been crucial for my emotional health. Jake and I have maintained our relationship, and it's actually become stronger since we've both been able to see our family dynamics clearly. He's continued to grow and take responsibility for his part in the dysfunction, even though he was also a victim of our parents' manipulation in many ways. Having one family member who can validate my experience and work toward a healthy relationship has been incredibly healing. My extended family relationships have also improved dramatically. Without my parents constantly managing the narrative about our family, other relatives have been able to see me clearly and develop individual relationships with me. Several of them have apologized for not intervening sooner, and all of them have been supportive of my decision to prioritize my mental health over family loyalty. The financial impact of my parents' deception will probably affect me for years. The money they stole could have eliminated my student debt, provided a house down payment, or given me the financial security to take career risks that might have paid off even more. But I've also learned that I'm capable of succeeding without their support, which is something they can never take away from me. More importantly, I've learned that my worth isn't determined by how my family treats me. I spent 26 years trying to earn love and recognition from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it, believing that if I just tried harder or achieved more, they'd finally see my value. The reality is that healthy love doesn't have to be earned through achievement or perfect behavior. It's given freely and consistently, and it doesn't get redirected based on favoritism or manipulation. If you're watching this and recognizing patterns from your own family, I want you to know that your feelings are valid. If you've been made to feel like you're being dramatic or oversensitive about differential treatment, trust your instincts. If you've been told that family loyalty means accepting unacceptable behavior, that's manipulation. If you've been made to feel like you have to earn basic respect and support, that's not love. Healthy families don't operate on scarcity principles where one child's success means another child gets less support. Healthy families don't systematically deceive their children about financial support. Healthy families don't gaslight their children when confronted with evidence of harmful behavior. If your family does these things, the problem isn't with you. Setting boundaries with toxic family members is one of the hardest things you'll ever do, but it's also one of the most important. You can't change people who refuse to acknowledge their harmful behavior, but you can change how much access they have to continue harming you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to step away from relationships that consistently damage your mental health and self-worth. The Scholarship Fund has shown me that our painful experiences can become sources of strength and healing for others. Every student who receives support through the fund represents a life that might be changed by having access to opportunities their families can't or won't provide. It's become a way to honor what I went through by ensuring that others don't have to face the same struggles alone. I want to end by saying that if you're in a similar situation, there is hope. You are not defined by how your family treats you. Your worth is not determined by whether they can see your value. You have the right to expect basic respect, honesty, and fairness in your relationships, even with family members. And if they can't provide those basic elements of healthy relationships, you have the right to protect yourself by limiting or ending contact. The hardest part of this entire experience was accepting that the family I'd hoped for, the parents I'd tried so hard to please, might never exist. But once I accepted that reality, I was free to build the life I actually wanted instead of the life I thought might finally earn their approval. That freedom has been worth every difficult moment of this journey. If this story resonated with you, please share your own experiences in the comments. There's something powerful about realizing you're not alone in dealing with family dysfunction and financial manipulation. And if you've found ways to heal and move forward, please share those too. We all need to know that it's possible to build happy, healthy lives, even when our families of origin fail us. Before you go, if this video helped you feel less alone or gave you permission to trust your own experiences, please like and subscribe. Creating content about difficult family dynamics isn't easy, but knowing it helps people makes it worthwhile. And remember, your story matters, your feelings are valid, and you deserve so much better than you might have been taught to expect.